Okay, so let's talk about time as a problem in research. The reason time is a problem isn't necessarily because you can't control it, but because time affects so many different factors. So many things are affected by time that it's almost impossible to be aware of all of those factors. You know, normally in research, we can when we deal with third variables, we can manipulate them. But because we can't manipulate time, all of those third variables that are happening get exponentially harder and harder to work with, and you have to account for more stuff in your limitations section. You have to come up with sometimes very clever research design paradigms to deal with them. Now, there are some pretty common research designs, and those are going to be longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. I believe we've talked about longitudinal studies at some point in the class. Just to remind you very quickly, a longitudinal study investigates something over time, like um, how does people's interest in baseball change over the course of the 20th and 21st century. A cross-sectional study is going to try to look at time all at once. What do I mean? Well, instead of watching a group of people over the course of many years, you're going to gather a bunch of people of different ages and see how they are affected or what their different opinions are going to be. Both longitudinal studies and cross-sectional studies are going to have their own problems. Longitudinal studies are going to have a lot of people drop out of the study. They're going to have changes in history affect your research, your maturation effects, and cross-sectional studies are going to have those same issues, but kind of at a staggered rate. So if you ask 15-year-olds how much they care about baseball versus 45-year-olds how much they care about baseball, their opinions are going to be different, but what causes those differences in opinion is going to be very difficult to parse out using that cross-sectional study because they could be totally different causes. So just to be clear, here are some examples of things that are going to affect time. They're going to affect your research that are kind of caused by time or related to time. Attrition is a big one. If you do a long-term research or research with a follow-up, attrition is how you lose participants over time. Even just having participants come back for a session 2 of a study, you tend to lose at least a third or a fourth of your participants, if not more, especially if you don't give them a particularly amazing reward for coming back. Cultural differences are going to be a huge effect of time. Of course, cultures change in different ways across different time spans, so you can imagine those changes compound hugely over time. A big one is the distant significance. What do I mean there? Well, so when you're doing research about, uh, if you're doing research about how does poverty affect the youth across their lifespan. So a lifespan is going to be maybe 60 to 80 years on average, and it could be that by the time you're done with that study, poverty is going to look totally different, and it's no longer going to be something that you can actually say as your research findings are no longer going to be actually totally generalizable. You can also, bring that down. Even just a 1 year scope or like a 10-year scope, those could completely change the realm of research that you're doing, those scenarios of research, and the validity and generalizability problems that you face there are just huge. And so even though you get loads of data by doing a longitudinal study or a long-term time-based study, you're going to come up with huge barriers to whether or not it was even worth it. Like I said, the internal validity and history problems associated with time-based studies are going to be a huge factor. So if you were doing a stress study, 2 or 3 years ago and it's going to last for 5 or 10 years, that study is going to be hugely affected by COVID. And so a lot of researchers, what they actually do is turn around and say, well, I know we were doing a stress study, but we're just going to say this is a study about how stress is affected by COVID. A lot of times, instead of just dealing with the validity problem, they kind of change the focus of their research. And so what does that mean for the validity of their study? If they want to understand, how afraid of pandemics are you, and they only realize that they should start asking that question after the pandemic happens, they are not going to have any good baseline data for that question. And so even if they change the focus of their study, it's still going to have some validity problems. Of course, cost is going to be a huge time-based issue, not just money costs, but time costs and effort costs. The amount of effort it takes to contact and work with people over just 1 or 2 weeks worth of research is huge. And so you can imagine the effort required to work with people over multiple years of time. Okay, so just to give you an example of the validity issues or the important factors involved in understanding longitudinal and cross-sectional studies, I've got a couple examples here. First off, the marshmallow study is a wonderful example of a longitudinal study. In this study, they had children sitting at a table with a marshmallow placed in front of them, and they told the kids, hey look, if you wait for 10 minutes and you don't eat this marshmallow, I'm going to give you a second one. So some of the kids managed to wait the 10 minutes, some of the kids didn't, and the study was talked about how, the kids who managed to hold off on eating the marshmallow and got the long-term reward had better self-control or responsibility or different factors like that. I don't remember exactly. But the more interesting part of this is that they actually followed those children over the course of their lifespan. And they found that those children did better in school. They found that those children did better in high school and then in college, and they found that those children were healthier adults, had better, I believe they also even said that they had better paying jobs. And so that longitudinal study that lasted, I believe it was around 30 years, was hugely impactful, very successful. People loved it. It was a wonderful study. How nice that you can say, well, if my kid can do this, or if I can train my kid to do this, they're going to have a successful life. But there were some problems. So one major problem was attrition. The study started out with a lot of people, and over time, over that set of 10, 20, 30 years, a lot of people dropped out of the study. People moved away, they stopped answering the contacts, some people died. And it turned out that the people who survived those 30 years, the people who still lived in the same area those 30 years, tended to be people who were affluent to start out with, tended to be people with better job prospects, who had more money, who lived in nicer neighborhoods. And so it makes sense that kids of families who have a better off life are going to do better overall. And it may be, in fact, that children who have a better off family are have a less hard time controlling themselves from eating that marshmallow. And so the longitudinal study was good and bad. Good in that it kind of revealed a possible confound, but bad in that the conclusions they drew from it may have been more attributed to the person's wealth than to the person's actual ability to hold on to the marshmallow. Let's take a look at an example of a cross-sectional study. And this is something called subjective age. It's a pretty interesting area of research. So it's not necessarily one study that we're talking about, but subjective age is asking a person, how old do you feel? Older adults tend to say they feel younger than they actually are. And in fact, the younger an adult feels, the longer they live. They have better health, they are more intelligent and more responsive to tests. Young adults tend to say that they are older, or that they feel older. And the older that those young adults feel, the more responsible they are, the more intelligent, the more conscientious they are. So it's going to be a cross-sectional study, because we didn't In those studies, you're not really going to see people who observed people's subjective age changing over time. Instead, for the most part, they involve asking people, hey, how old do you feel? And they would ask young people and old people, they'll ask children and adults, they'll ask older adults and younger adults at the same time. And then maybe follow up with them a while later. So what are the good things and bad things about these subjective age factors? Well, a good thing is that we can compare subjective age and its effects for older and younger adults. But a bad thing is that, well, maybe subjective age is different for younger and older adults. Maybe older adults grew up in a time when being younger was better, but younger adults are currently growing up in a time where being older is better, and that's why they have those relationships to the subjective age question. It could be that subjective age is a bigger factor in the mortality for older adults because they're afraid of dying, or because subjective age, how old you feel, is affected or caused by how healthy you are. That same set of health factors is really not going to be something that affects younger adults, and so maybe the subjective age question shouldn't be treated as the same variable for older and younger adults, because they're answering the question differently, because they have a different socio-cultural relationship to that question. So longitudinal studies and cross-sectional studies are going to help us deal with time and time-related factors like age. They give us wonderful research, exciting research, but just like any other type of research, there are going to be flaws to them. And they're going to be flaws that are caused by their quasi-experimental nature. We can't always make those causal connections, or it's going to be even less possible to make those causal connections because we can't control things going on. Okay. Other things you can do about time. Follow-up studies are wonderful. Follow-up study involves gathering data on participants and then later gathering some more data on those participants. Like in the subjective age study, watching how many people lived depending on their subjective age, or in the marshmallow study, seeing how well people were doing later on in their lives. What is the value of a follow-up study? Well, it can help you understand whether an intervention was beneficial. If you give students an intervention to improve their test scores, following up with them a year later is beneficial in understanding, well, did that intervention improve their test scores overall, or did it just do that for that test? It also helps you understand how things are going. You know, in the marshmallow study, the follow-up studies assessing people's success in life helped researchers understand that it was wealth that may have caused the marshmallow effect. Just to be clear, a follow-up study involves conducting research, and then the research ends, and then maybe you wait a year or you wait some amount of time, and then you do a follow-up study, usually some sort of survey, but maybe you have some experimental manipulation there. A different type of follow-up are called follow-up measures. Follow-up measures involve just making sure that the study made sense or worked after the study concludes or during some parts of the study. These are also known as manipulation checks. So let's say that you bring a person into a classroom and you have them answer questions. And the thing is, the rest of the classroom is not actually regular participants. They're all people who are in on the study, and they purposefully answer the questions in a wrong way. And you want to see if the real participant eventually gets to the point where they're answering the questions that same wrong way. So what you could do is have people participate in the study and then see, hey, were you aware of what was going on? Did you notice anything? Because in that study, it's crucial that the participants be unaware that they are the only real participant and everyone else in the study is kind of a fake person. If you ask people, hey, were you aware that those people were fake or that something was up, you can get a better idea of whether or not your study was working. So follow-up measures are a wonderful way to deal with time-based issues as well as just any sort of quasi-experimental problems.